I'm Evan Gilman, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called SPIRL. And we're working on a problem called workload identity, which is, how we secure service-to-service interactions, or quote workload-to-workload interactions. Is typically happening inside the data center and your cloud providers, that kind of stuff. I'm also the author of Zero Trust Networks, a book, Riley book published in 2017, the first book published on topic of Zero Trust, and also the author of an open standard called SPIFFE, which is the CNCF project. And so workload identity technology, and is also the technology on which we're building product at Spire.
You and I had a brief but interesting conversation, and it was around the fact that you had written a book in 2017 around Zero Trust and how things have evolved from there. Yeah. And I know that one of the things that you had started saying to me right before we turned on the recording was, you saw Zero Trust falling into two buckets. Is that a good starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that we can kind of devolve it further from there, but I would say it was, during the writing of that book took 2 years. It was 2 years, and really it was like a year's worth of research, and that's like phone calls and talking to people, all tackling different bits and pieces of this bigger pie that we now kind of try to call Zero Trust, at least. And trying to kind of get a sense of the bigger picture, and then a year of it was writing. And even in that kind of research writing phase that we went through, we had these early indications that, hey, there's kind of two different modalities that we think about in Zero Trust, and very interestingly, those modalities are pretty well aligned with like how the book got written. The book got written because me and my co-author were working on some, I would call, novel arrangement of existing technologies. And inside the infrastructure that we were working on, and the goal there in that work was, hey, like we're running a SaaS service. It runs across multiple cloud providers. We've got it's an active deployment. We've got database traffic running across the internet and all kinds of other nasty things. And how are we supposed to think about securing this infrastructure? Cross region, cross cloud, all have different ideas of how to do this and whatnot. And so we were kind of put in this position where we were forced to build out this, platform agnostic, machine to machine, service to service security layer, right? Which includes everything from access control to privacy and confidentiality. And so
at a workload, but beyond a workload level, correct?
This was, we built out the works we did there was very much like, I would call kind of like peer-to-peer style.
Got it.
Every node in the infrastructure kind of participated in this scheme and formed a security relationship with every other node in the infrastructure. We didn't have any of these kinds of like VPN site-to-site tunnels and private networks in each site and that kind of stuff. We didn't, have the luxury of that actually at the time.
So tell me the two buckets, and then I have a follow-up question.
Right. So we were very much focused on that kind of work. Now, the whole epiphany that came, that set the light bulb off, it was like, okay, oh wow, like this is a much bigger thing. It's not just like some cool kind of security work that we did over here in our corner. There's a bigger idea, and that epiphany came when we started to read the BeyondCorp papers coming out of Google, and those BeyondCorp papers were talking about very similar ideas. How do we move trust away from the network? How do we instead very carefully manage trust in the relationships between different communicating parties? And the BeyondCorp papers that Google published were largely about, human to service interactions, human to app, if you will. And that was kind of the epiphany, because it's like, hey, here are the same ideas and principles being applied in a totally different way for a different set of problems, but there's a commonality underneath, right? And in the world where you're authenticating humans to apps, there's all kinds of specific things there, like human-related authentication primitives and things like that. In the world where you're doing service to service or workload to workload authentication and authorization, there's a whole different kind of set of technologies that you lean on there, but the underlying principles are the same. And so that was the realization, like, oh shoot, there's something bigger. We should be talking about this way of thinking, how to think about building these kinds of systems, whether they're for human or otherwise. And so the two buckets that have kind of made themselves apparent since then, and continue to be a thing, is, are we talking about human to app, like human access, or are we talking about workload and machine and service access? And the way that you kind of skin that cat are a little bit different on both sides, but they're connected by these underlying principles.
That makes sense to me. One of the things that got me to want to have a conversation with you was the core differences of what you meant when you were writing, and how some entities have used it as marketing speak, and they don't match. I'm a lover of marketing speak, so it's like, but I have to be like marketing speak, but it not matching what it was meant to, and so it ends up being almost in some ways a flip of what you were meaning. And so can you, I know this is going to get like possibly in the weeds, but like, here's what we meant, or here's our beliefs behind it even, and here's where some will put it instead, because I think they are, for lack of a better way of saying it, two different camps that happen. Totally. And the problem is that by and large, most people don't know that there is even two ways of thinking. And so like, I had someone say, like, but such and such company has said all you need is them and the author of your choice, and then everything's secure, and you don't need to worry about what's inside and how things are communicating, and like that, that's how the world works. And I'm like, that seems stupid or insane. Just an observation. And they're like, oh, but that's what people think, and so that's what matters. And I'm like, I don't think that like actually secures things.
I think that's what people want.
Yes, so here's a great thing that you actually did not know when you told me you wrote the book on zero trust, is because I haven't done this recently, but I spent a good 6 to 9 months walking around saying zero trust is not a solution, it's a goal. And it is potentially an architecture, but it's a goal. It's not the end game, because you can't assume that everything will work.
Yeah, totally. I would even go one step further and say that, it's more like a practice and mindset. I like, I find a lot of similarities with the term DevOps, when it first came around, and all those people running around, DevOps is this, DevOps is that, sometimes conflicting definitions.
Yeah.
And it feels very much like zero trust is very deep in that kind of phase of confusion, right?
Yeah. With DevOps, we I used to say, like, don't say that you're targeting DevOps, because nobody has that title.
Yeah.
Like that is not a title, and it may or may not be now, but it definitely was not a title for a long time.
Yeah, it was kind of I believe it was a bit of an anti-pattern to make it a title.
Yeah.
Though I have seen it as a title.
Yeah.
I would call it a practice, right?
Yes.
Kind of like Agile as a practice. You don't have usually Agile engineers, or
Yeah, well, unless you're in a large enough organization, you need to code all the different engineers. But I digress.
DevOps guys, I guess.
Yeah. So if you can, let's talk about, like, what are those two different buckets of, not two different buckets, I'm sorry, the two different, like, here's how we saw the world, our philosophy. Here's how we saw the world and what we meant. Here is the way others see it that seems to fit into their existing solution.
Scope and perspective, right? So, when we first embarked on this whole thing, and we were, screwing around with what do we title this book, the term zero trust came to mind because, hey, like, all the work that we're doing is about eliminating as much implicit trust as possible from these systems, right? We want to make sure that everything going through these systems is explicitly checked and trusted, or trustworthy is probably a better word. And so, zero trust came to mind, but that was pretty broad. It's like, okay, well, what are we not trusting? And so, the title of the book ended up being Zero Trust Networks, because we wanted to be explicit about, hey, look, we're talking specifically about computer networks, right? And removing, the implicit trust from those networks, such that you can run a trustworthy system on top of untrustworthy networks, right? So, I think that we did a good job threading that needle, but that point was lost kind of between the time that, we published the book and now. So, even
So which point specifically
that work was very focused on
on the
removing
networks?
stuff from network. Yeah.
Got it.
The analyst community, Forrester, Gartner, and all of them, have since come and said, oh, there's these different pillars, and network is one, but there's data, and there's all these other things, right? And that might be the case, and that's an interesting thing. But my work has specifically been kind of on network and service communication. And even then, though, there's prior art out of Gartner, actually, or Forrester rather. Prior art out of Forrester that coined this term zero trust back in 2009. A guy named John Kinderbog. And we talked to him a few times during the authorship of that book, and we had a lot of very similar ideas. But as the work went on and we got to the end, what we realized was we were kind of talking about two opposite things. Similar ideas, but opposite kind of approach, right? And so, whereas we really focused and wrote about how do you really explicitly manage trust, drive it into the system in a very explicit way and a verifiable way, right? And that's how you kind of that's how you go about getting a trustworthy result and trustworthy execution. The prior art from Forrester was more focused on actually kind of the opposite. How do we remove trust from all the systems that are connected to the network and actually trust the network to do all of the heavy lifting of security and filtering? And that difference in perspective came with next generation firewalls, and this thing and all these kind of like network middle boxes and machinery. So I think, we uncovered this kind of disagreement, and I don't know if that's still the common belief, but in the industry, I see that there's kind of wholly been accepted that when we talk about zero trust networks, we're talking about distrusting the network, not so much the systems. And so there is this division, right? If you look at Palo Alto Networks, which John worked at for some time, you'll see them talking about zero trust, next generation firewalls, and this and that. And then there's kind of the more software centric approaches to this, which I think Palo Alto actually now is starting to pick some up.
At some point, it is put your total trust in X so that you don't have to trust anything else. But you have to put, I think, even more trust in that thing that is saying like, oh, like my version in the beginning of like, it'll be whatever. For the record, it was not Palo Alto that I was talking about, but it was another large organization that was like, you wrap it around this and you put the auth of your choice, and then it's just like everything's secure. And I think that to your point, that's a goal, or not even a goal, it's a pipe dream.
Yeah.
I used to draw this picture of a castle, like a fortress, and I would have an arrow that says this way in, and I was like, this is a security posture that everyone wants to believe they have. And then I would draw a chain link fence, and I was like, and here is reality. There's a lot of ways in, and there's a lot of space in between there. That's even once you're in there, but you got to be able to see what's happening.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've done several talks in which I've had similar kind of talk track where, when you take a step back and you look at the evolution of security in this realm, there was a lot of kind of network centric security, middle boxes and things like that in kind of the Middle Ages, if you will.
Yeah.
And that was all well and fine when you had a very small number of internet applications, and those small number of internet applications nominally managed by some central team, and you had an email server maybe and that kind of stuff, right? But now people are coming and going. You've got bring your own device, you've got remote work, you've got all kinds of like that perimeter, which literally used to be like brick and mortar that you badge into, right, is all of a sudden like super duper porous, and you can't just shut it down because you need this to function. And so how do you secure it in that kind of new landscape, right? And I think there's zero trust, I feel like, has enjoyed kind of a bit of a a boost from COVID for exactly this reason.
Well, so I had this thought earlier today, which is, talking about securing around remote workers or hybrid workers, but are we really that much? And you could tell me, yeah, we definitely are. But if everyone's on site, are we really that much more secure than if somebody is going in and out? If the way they're accessing it is with the same devices or something, like, are we that much more secure?
I don't think so.
That was my thing.
Yeah, it's less, in that case, like in that COVID case, right? It's less about, hey, how do we get more secure than we were before? And it's more about, hey, how do we enable these new patterns without lowering the bar?
Right.
And ideally you raise the bar, but we can't we need to support this new business patterns and not lower the bar. And so it's been a lot more carrot than stick, I feel, and like in this latest COVID thing. On prem, people are coming into the office, they still bring things in from home, they're still going to bring their laptop home outside of your protection, do their things, not to mention like wire crypto, everything like that. It is fairly trivial to get something dropped and running behind the firewall these days, right? Like that's a pretty easy thing to do. And so long as that is the soft underbelly, you're going to have a problem, And so I think that's like the fundamental issue. And then the carrot that's kind of been bringing people away is like all of a sudden, people aren't badging into the office every day. So how do you accommodate that?
Well, so maybe actually, maybe it's actually that we're not less secure because people are sometimes not in the office. Maybe it's more that we have the potential to be even more secure because we're acknowledging that they were always taking their laptop out of the office. Yeah. They were always doing these things, and that we weren't acknowledging and we weren't actually securing for it. So maybe we're actually have the potential to be more secure now.
It could actually, yeah. I mean, I could very easily see that. And of course, I would say that, these new patterns are better, right? Like they do not allow for any network device that can pop up and grab an IP to go and access, whatever enterprise resources you have in the, user-facing side, for example. And so, and that's kind of a core thing. Like people say, well, I have my network inside this colo, or I have my network inside this badged office, and so I have some physical protection around it. And it's like, that's true, but if your threat model approaches from a way that you expect those physical links to be compromised, and you also get protection from compromised machines that may be perfectly allowed to be on that network,
right?
Or somebody's walked in the office and plugged in, or who knows what happens, right? And so I think like it's just better hygiene all around.
Well, so that makes sense. So what you're doing now is very workload focused. How does this translate into the workloads, or how does it extend into the workloads then?
This is a common like question that I run into, and the way that, and as with most things, like the explanation has been evolving over the years, right? But the way that I describe it these days is why do I care about this? I think the world latched onto kind of the user to app cases of zero trust first. It's very clear why, right? We have phishing, we have all this other stuff going on, like the reports saying like these are the top of the ways in and all this stuff. But this kind of latter half of the story has been conveniently ignored for quite some time, and now we're starting to see people pay attention to it, because the reality is, why do you have a user? Why is there security around user interacting with an app? It's because, well, hey, that user has access to sensitive information, and you want to control and really make sure that it's that user who is retrieving that information or interacting with the system. And at the end of the day, that user's logging into an app, doing those interactions, but that's more than one service, right? Like there's many services back there, and all those services also have access to this very sensitive data. And so it's only logical to say, well, I also want to make sure that they're only accessing this data, at the appropriate time when the data owner has requested it. And how do you protect these kinds of service interactions that have largely been kind of hand wavy and opaque for many years? And so when I think about it, I think about it in the very same way that you authenticate user to an app. Apps need to authenticate to apps, right? And the security properties there need to be similar.
do you see the workload to workload still being part of the zero trust story?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
assume so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, it's the part that I find a lot of passion in, and it's
Right.
the world that I come from, you know. And I mentioned earlier the story about writing the book, right? Like all
Right.
the work I had done was on workload to workload stuff, and the discovery of the other side of this coin, and the, you know, the human to workload, human to app stuff. So I spend most of my time there, and I feel like, you know, if you look at any single one of these breaches, almost all of them involve some kind of infrastructure lateral movement.
Yes.
And this is exactly the kind of stuff we're talking about when we talk about workload to workload security, right? And 99% of those cases of lateral movement is illegitimate lateral movement. If least trust had been, if least privilege had been properly applied in those system to system interactions, wouldn't have happened.
Well,
And
okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, I think that the privileged access is also something that we have to acknowledge, like, is not even applied across the board. You know, it is, which actually is something, frankly, that surprised me, because I had expected it to be more widespread use, because it was, you know, it was part of you know, we say like the ideal version
Yeah.
of the world, you know, it was there, but there's just organizations that are of differing size. It's not
Yeah.
just small ones, it's of differing size that don't have it, or have only applied it in small areas.
Yeah, and it's not even it's even worse than that. Because, you know, it's not like we talk about this privileged access management, which is, you know, the humans accessing systems
Right.
problem, and that is not even consistently, you know, a
Right.
controlled, consistently applied. That we're only getting started on the workload to workload stuff. How do you say this particular workload is able to access this privileged information at this time? We don't have good answers for this right now. Especially don't have good answers for this right now when it involves a human principle. Like, you know, I often use the Gmail case, right? Like, hey, I'm a user logging into Gmail. I want to read my inbox. Well, there's 5,000 services back there that these requests transit and whatnot. And when those requests go and fan out in order to give me my inbox, like the back end, which is storing my mail, really wants to know that I actually asked for that thing.
Right.
You know, also wants to know, like, hey, infrastructure machines in my infrastructure have made this request to me and no information about who has processed that thing, and also wants to know that this user legitimately asked for that resource, right? And all these things need to be able to come together in order to give assurance at the data access layer that this thing's actually authorized. And we're only getting started on answering these kinds of questions right now.
Yeah, it's not to take us off in a different direction, but you know, Gartner has started talking about identity proofing. But even when they talk about it, what they're talking about is really comes down to, you know, they talk about the need to know who it is in the real world, but then it ends up falling into, at least now seems to be falling into, areas where you're looking at a two-factor authentication.
Right, sure.
And I'm like, yeah, you know, or privilege access, you know, somehow with privilege access. And I've just said, like, there's a ton that don't
Yeah.
have that. So, you know, there is a, I like the identifying the need. The solution is like, you know, we're just at the point of the solutions now.
Yeah.
And I think that that's, you know, that is an interesting place to be playing. Oh, obviously, I think it's an
100
interesting place to be playing.
100%. Yeah. So like the work that, you know, to that effect, like a lot of the work I've been doing in SPIFFE is around workload identity. I mentioned earlier. What does that mean? That means, hey, I have a process that's running in my infrastructure, and I want to be able to issue that process a credential that represents an identity. And that workload should be able to use this credential to prove its identity to other workloads, other platforms and vendors and APIs and things like that, in a relatively universal way that's not coupled to, you know, the platform or runtime that it's operating in.
Yeah.
And in these implementations, these SPIFFE implementations, you know, we've put a lot of focus on what does that credentialing process looks like. So to what you were saying earlier about identity proofing, right? Like, how do you know for sure that
Right.
this thing is the thing, right?
Yeah.
And SPIFFE solves this in a very interesting way that analogs kind of some existing systems in AWS and GCP and other places, where there's an unauthenticated API that gets exposed to the workload, to which the workload can attach to and say, hey, I'm here, give me my identity, please be giving me my identity and my key and whatever else I need to go prove myself. And when that call happens, all these measurements occur, right? So we call them, attestations in our world. But that's both, attesting the underlying hardware, attesting the instance on the cloud platform. It's
Right.
also like kernel introspection, measuring, the different properties of this process, the user it's running as, the SHA of the binary that got loaded, all this kind of stuff, right? And we gather this huge set of information. And the reason I'm kind of going down this is that some people have pointed at that process and said, oh, this reminds me of multi-factor auth. But it's like n-factor auth, right?
Right. Right.
It's
Exactly.
like we're collecting this huge number of measurements, and then it is a matter of your local policy as to which of those measurements must align before you
Right.
credential or issue an identity.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I had originally, again, we had an original conversation about zero trust, but as I was looking at what you were doing, it is very much it's very akin to the way that we're approaching it with human beings, and looking at it's not just and we're not looking at it for the getting in the door, we're looking at it for the ongoing. And so it is, it's not just that we only look at the way the typing style and the pacing, and and not looking at raw keystrokes, but looking at like how style, like the example I always give is, for all the like timing and different things, my left pinky caps on and caps off all the time. There are certain things that I interact with all the time that just are different and are very much me. And even the fact that like in this office, I operate quite different than when I'm typing at 2 a.m. in a different room.
Totally.
The location's not as much the issue as like I have certain things that I do when I'm typing at 2 a.m. that are very unique to how I type then. And so, and what I interact with. Unfortunately, all still work related, but like what I'm interacting with is still like a different thing. And so knowing that it's that is the it's if I'm the developer, there's like parts where both of those fit together.
Yeah.
And that actually goes to, and I know like we need to end at some point, but that actually goes to like my biggest theme. And the reason I started doing this series was because I really believe that the ecosystem needs to all address everything together and needs to work together, because we can't just like slap a name on something that already exists and go like, hey, and now it's this. It'll fix all your things. And not really secure, because like at the core, that's what we're trying to do, is secure things.
I love you highlighting this kind of behavioral stuff that you've been working on at Momodo, because I see so many similarities there. One to that, how you're kind of identifying users and humans, and SPIFFE, how we're identifying workloads.
Yeah.
One person told me, hey, this is kind of like a recognition-based authentication system, right? Like the system, like in SPIFFE, we have like 5,000 different measurements and that we can use to kind of very precisely describe a thing, right? And it's similar in your world. There's a recognition of this entity based on 5,000 plus.
Well, we've been using the term continuous recognition. So yes, very much so.
We use the word continuous attestation.
There we go. See, I knew I liked you the moment I met you. Why don't I stop there, because otherwise we'll just go down the road. And it's so good to end with the fact that we've decided that we think each other is great.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.